I want to begin this talk running after Windrush in the past. And I want to move into the past, if we can, imaginatively as a collective. For us to imagine all of us together, sort of journeying back to a moment in time, to stand on the sidelines and watch as spectators. Specifically, I want us to go back to a Friday evening in late August 1958, to Latimer Road Tube Station, where, if you imagine us all together, observing, we see a Swedish woman named Margaret Morrison falling into an argument with her Jamaican husband, Raymond, as they leave the underground station. We watch as people congregate, as the Morrisons' dispute grows steadily more heated. Their conflict is suddenly transformed, kind of, a little lover spat, when a man in the crowd begins shouting racial slurs at Raymond Morrison, apparently believing that it's his duty to protect a white woman from a threatening black man. I want us to imagine ourselves there again in Notting Hill near the tube station, watching this couple arguing where a man intervenes, and see Margaret stop arguing with her husband and turn to defend him from the attacker, which leads some members of the now gathering crowd to turn on her and call her a series of racial slurs. A group of the Morrisons' West Indian friends then gather, arriving at the scene at the tube station in Notting Hill, where we stand on the sidelines and watch, and begin shouting themselves, as the shouting then escalates between the two groups, between the couple, between all who are spectating and around, and a fight breaks out. Fast forward, the next night, we're all still there and watching crowds spill out of local pubs in Notting Hill. We watch them spot Margaret Morrison from the night before on her way home down the high street, a group of people suddenly chasing her back to her house, volleying a series of taunts and insults and racial slurs and throwing milk bottles. When Morrison stands her ground and refuses police orders to go inside, the police have now arrived, we watch as she, rather than the members of the marauding crowd, is arrested. Then we watch the crowd grow and grow and spread. What followed the verbal and physical attacks on the Morrisons, which were real events that took place in Notting Hill, were, as some of you might know, several days of rioting. Marauding bands of mostly young men, spurred on not least by the fascist Oswald Mosley's calls for them to, quote, take action now, protect your jobs, stop colored immigration, flooded onto the streets, seeking any Caribbean migrants they could find, any others, visible others, they could spot. Some of these young men were armed with iron bars, some had Molotov cocktails, some, according to a handful of reports, had butcher's knives. They smashed the windows of houses Caribbean people lived in, broke items identified as owned by them, and attacked many on the streets. It wasn't until the Caribbean people themselves fought back en masse, also now armed, that the rioting stopped. I want us to make one more stop as a collective, journeying back into the past together to sit on the edge of something as spectators. Fast forward from the events we just recalled to just under 1 year later, back in Notting Hill, again, a second time, on the 17th of May, 1959. It's just after midnight. Having had his finger, which he'd broken at work, replastered at the local hospital, the Antiguan carpenter Kelso Cochrane is walking home. We, all of us, see him close in on the house where he shared a room with his partner, Olivia, when a gang of young white men surround him. They call him many names, punch him, push him, thump him, and then stab him in the heart. When he collapses, they run away. We see two black men walking nearby rush over. A taxi stops. Cochrane's picked up and put in the cab. We ride with them to the hospital, but by the time we arrive, Kelso Cochrane has stopped breathing. We leave and overhear someone calling a reporter at the Sunday Express, and they say, and I quote, 3 white youths have stabbed a darky named Cochrane. The stories I want to tell you, the works I want to introduce you to today, or in some cases I think refamiliarize you with, emerge out of the wake of those 2 events which I just described and which we all imaginatively witnessed. They're two moments which didn't themselves transform the lives of Caribbean people in Britain and their descendants, but which, to borrow the words of a literary scholar, Matthew Mead, marked what he calls an alteration in the British imaginary. By that he means, or by that I mean, I'm borrowing the term, that these two events demonstrably shifted the narrative in circulation in the era about England, about the territories then referred to as the West Indies, about safety in the quote-unquote mother country, about the true composition of the English nation, about the legacies of the colonial era, about immigrants and residents, about blackness and whiteness, in ways the targets of those attacks kept with them for generations. But before turning to the works I want to introduce you to, and journeying into what follows, I would like to briefly just say thank you. Thank you first to the organizers for inviting me to speak today in this relatively grand, seemingly very inflammable venue. Thank you very much to the audience, for all of you, for taking a chunk of your evenings to spend some time with me here talking to and with and at you tonight. And thank you, very importantly, for what I have to say to two scholars who are named Hengame Sarakani and John McLeod, who provided the inspiration for this talk, and in their recent work sort of invited us, scholars, general readers, the general public, thinkers of all kinds, to return to and rethink the Windrush and what it means in this, the 75th anniversary year of the arrival of Britain's most famous decommissioned troop ship. So I borrowed my title, Writing After Windrush, from both of them, again, Hengame Sarakani, John McLeod, in their recent issue of Wasafiri, which, again, full disclosure, I used to edit, called Writing the Scandal. Sarakani and McLeod invite us to think anew about those now dubbed the Windrush generation. In their introduction to this special issue, they note how Windrush as a concept has been uniquely mobile in Britain, but has come again in this 75th anniversary year, this anniversary of the arrival of the ship, the famous disembarkations, to be tainted and transformed into a kind of shorthand for national shame. In their words, Windrush has, and this is a quotation, named the wider generation of Arabants from the once colonized countries in post-war years. It has been mobilized, as was the case in the 1998 50th anniversary celebrations, to proclaim and amplify the history of multiracial Britain's irresistible rise. It has been appropriated via the government-sponsored Windrush Day events each June as an officially branded symbol of migrant and migrant-descended contribution to national life. And it's been positioned, as in Danny Boyle's 2012 opening ceremony for the Olympic Games, which some of you may recall, a very sort of dramatic moment in that ceremony, as a proud vessel of Britain's collective evolution. And again, just recalling that 2012 ceremony, some of you may have seen it, some of you frighteningly might have been too young to see it, which is a bit scary. We have this huge pageant of activity taking place on this massive stage at the opening of the Olympics. And then there's a moment where this reconstruction of the Windrush is escorted out into the center of, I believe it was a stadium. And then from that moment on, there's a kind of change in the composition of Britain. It functions as a kind of catalytic moment of alteration in the composition of the state. So, name the wider generation of Arrivants, mobilized to proclaim and amplify the history of multiracial Britain, appropriated as an official branded symbol of migrant and migrant-descended contribution to national life, and a sign, a symbol of a proud vessel of Britain's collective evolution. So far, so positive. However, in the same introduction, they note how the term Windrush has gathered new meaning in recent years, primarily through the publicity of what many of you will know, around the work of Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman, who exposed this, what's now called the Windrush scandal, of deportation of people with a right to live in Britain, citizens of Britain, to the Caribbean, in the wake of them not being able to provide papers to show that they had a right to reside. It was this moment, the deportation scandal, one slice or spoke of a broader government initiative called the hostile environment, which is worth pausing to stand and reflect on, especially in the light of the way we're thinking of the legacies of some recent politicians in the country. So hostile environment was an umbrella term for a series of policies and initiatives inaugurated by then Home Secretary and future Prime Minister Theresa May in and around the passage of the 2014 Immigration Act. And on the screen is just an image of deportation vans, which were part of a publicity campaign called Operation Vac-In, launched in 2013. The 2014, so the year after Immigration Act, was a kind of landmark in the way that it figured and framed the status of migrants in Britain. Firstly, enforcement of the Act was all focused on removal, and uniquely within the sort of sphere of government legislation. You can look this Act up online. There's some lecture notes where I've included the URL. Its first section, the first paragraph, is about removal. So not about anything to do with settlement or status or change of status or support or anything like that. It's about getting people out. Enforcement was focused on removal, as I said, and led to thousands of detentions, deportations, and several deaths. It brought, for the first time, regular citizens within the regime of immigration control, placing an onus upon landlords and NHS workers to check the status of the people they worked with to see if they were allowed to be in Britain, if they should be eligible for the services they provide based on their citizenship status. The Windrush scandal then was an emanation of that. And quoting an interview with the author Carol Phillips in the special issue and the introduction I've made reference to, they say, this is a quote, "Windrush once signified a frustratingly false and congratulatory mythology. It stood for a dehistoricized narrative of national uplift and perceived multicultural unanimity. That story erased a much longer history of hostility toward migrants and newcomers, and Windrush now can no longer serve as an emblem of a fantasy multicultural bliss." In their special issue, these two scholars invite us to use Windrush as a lens through which to view and review the history of migration to Britain, to use it as, quote, a space or a means of critical reflection and interrogation, to think simultaneously through Windrush of the multicultural dream and the night terrors that have always accompanied it. For the rest of this talk, I want to follow their call and allow the after in my title to echo as loudly as the Windrush, to create space for us, again as a collective, to think together about the after, about the post, about the what happens in the wake, and how that presses on and reshapes our understanding of the thing that precedes and forces reconsideration of the initiating event. Therefore, how what happens after something necessarily alters the way we see the event itself. Together, I want to do some brief work to reawaken ourselves to life in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Britain for Caribbean people. And for the HMT Windrush itself and what it's come to symbolize, I want to think of the fates of the human beings behind the infinitely reproduced still images, the postcard snapshots of men in suits and hats and women in their Sunday best on gangplanks, on piers, and getting onto trains and off too. Before that, though, it's necessary to drop in a significant piece of prehistory to which the arrival of the Windrush itself is an after. And that piece of prehistory is the many centuries of Caribbean colonization. It's always important to highlight, I think, when talking about the Caribbean, and as Sophie said, I'm kind of a scholar of Caribbean literature and necessarily dip into Caribbean history. It's necessary when you speak about the Caribbean, always within the context of colonialism, to highlight how significantly different the Caribbean colonial effort was from other efforts of colonization elsewhere in the world. The most succinct, and it's not that succinct, quotation about this that I've found comes from an anthropologist named Sidney Mintz. And he, and this is a long quotation, said that the colonies in the Caribbean were not erected upon massive indigenous bases in areas of declining great literate civilizations, as were true in India and Indonesia. They were not mere points of trade, like Macau or Shanghai, where ancestral cultural hinterlands could remain surprisingly unaffected in spite of the exercise of considerable European power. There were not tribal mosaics within which European colonizers carried on their exploitation, accompanied by some curious vision of a civilizing mission, as in Congo or New Guinea. Nor were there areas of intense European settlement, where new forms of European culture provided an acultural anchor for other newcomers, as in the United States or Australia. They were, in fact, the oldest industrial colonies in the West outside of Europe, and fitted to European needs with particular intensity and pervasiveness. I just want to linger on this quotation for a moment. So again, he's almost defining the Caribbean through a kind of antithesis, what it isn't. And what is unique about the space, so the islands of the sort of two archipelagic chains of the Caribbean, the Windward and Leeward Islands, and also the border areas, places now named Belize, the Guyanas, and so on, were territories which played a very different role within the colonial world for a variety of European powers, the main ones in the area being the English, the French, and the Dutch. They played a very different role from colonies in Africa, in Asia, and Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. They were industrial, he says. And I take that as meaning that their sole purpose, much like a factory, was to maximize wealth by facilitating trade. These islands and littoral zones were settled by successive European powers in the wake of the genocide of local people, Arawaks and Tainos, Amerindians, Native Americans by another name, and the ecocide of local flora and other non-human fauna in order to make space for an unprecedented extraction enterprise. And it can't be underscored the extent to which what was happening in the Caribbean was something singular. These places were cleared of most native flora and fauna, repopulated with cash crops, and then those cash crops for several centuries were extracted and extracted and extracted. People, animals, land, resources across the islands and the bordering shorelines were rearranged and remade to maximize commodity output. The production of cash crops, including and especially sugarcane, took precedence over the welfare of the majority population, composed first of enslaved men, women, children, and infants with origins across Africa, and later their descendants and descendants of indentured servants who were brought in to replace their labor. So some of you will know this, many of you might not. In the Caribbean, after emancipation, understandably, many formerly enslaved people left plantations and refused to return. Although at the time that was framed as laziness, one now in the 21st century might be able to look back and think, well, maybe I wouldn't want to go back to the place where I was exploited. So to replace that labor, people from Asia, in particular South Asia, were shipped over to the Caribbean as indentured servants. It was seen as the most cost-effective way to get the plantations back up and running. And between people of African descent and Asian descent, these are the majority populations in the Caribbean and have been for quite some time. So because of local exploitation, the circumstances of repopulation, and the effects of overpopulation, mortality rates in the area were always extremely high because people did backbreaking day-long labor in tropical conditions. So they were always overpopulated. They wanted to be an excess or surplus of labor to replace people who were regularly passing away. Because of repopulation and the effects of overpopulation to meet labor needs, Caribbean people were and have been, as long as they have been reported in history, mobile, in circulation in and beyond the region. There have been emigrants, migrants, displaced peoples who, in the English-speaking regions, which are our focus for today, so those areas colonized by England, took advantage of opportunities after World War II to journey to what they understood to be the mother country, England itself. So there's an earlier lecture in this Gresham series available online on the website called The Windrush Writers and Artists, that covers the ground of what happened next for those who came to England after 1948. Effectively, three things occurred, that lecture says. Hopeful arrival to a well-known but little settled mother country, the discovery of some real opportunities for work and to establish lives and families, enterprises and communities, and then disillusionment at a hostile response. Hope, discovery, disillusionment. I'm interested today primarily in the third thing. So writing of his feelings about the Notting Hill riots and their immediate aftermath, in his 1960 book, The Pleasures of Exile, Barbadian novelist George Lamming claimed that, in the wake of the event, we must accept, this is a quotation, we must accept that racial antagonism in Great Britain is, after Notting Hill, an atmosphere and a background against which my life and yours, that of the assumed reader of any background, are being lived. And this is Lamming. And this is The Pleasures of Exile, but a new edition. He describes how, after the event, after what he calls the sirens of Notting Hill, he began to watch himself around white English people in a way he had never before, in a way he imagines the English move through life on high alert, hyper-aware of potential attack after and around the Blitz. Lamming wasn't, in the words of his contemporary, the better-known now, I think, writer Samuel Selvon, a, quote, hustling immigrant in a factory. He was an emissary of a very educated Caribbean elite. In his native Barbados, where he was born, and in Trinidad, where he spent the formative years of his life as a young man, he belonged to a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the local society. He was a scholarship boy, so the recipient of a paid-for education at an elite school in the region, something only very, very few people could be, something they could do. He was trained at one of the region's better institutions and completed his education there, which was a rarity as well. And also, even more rare, he was a writer. He was, therefore, both in the Caribbean and in Britain, a member of the elite. In Britain, specifically, he was, through links forged across the Atlantic and the London publication of a lauded first novel called In the Castle of My Skin, a frequent contributor to the BBC and the recipient of multiple prizes and fellowships. Lamming, a member of the elite, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of Caribbean society, at home and also here, his outraged response to Notting Hill signals the extent, for me at least, to which this event in 1958 was a leveler. Regardless of your backgrounds, your potential, your accolades, your social stature, your intelligence, everything, Lamming, like his contemporaries, writers and workers, all visual outsiders, became a part of a single putatively threatening, but actually threatened mass. Lamming called this book, The Pleasures of Exile, a, quote, frank and authentic indictment of the English consciousness. And in it, he compares himself in England to the murdered Kelso Cochrane, a fellow Caliban confronting an English Prospero, both terms taken from Shakespeare's Tempest. Prospero being sort of exiled magician, Caliban exiled to a remote island, Caliban being his effectively enslaved servant who's native to the island. Lamming presents himself as a Caliban and England as the Prospero. He says, in spite of our differences in fortunes, the West Indian, Kelso Cochrane, who was murdered in Notting Hill, is an eternal part of the writing Caliban himself, who has at least warned Prospero, England, that his privilege of absolute ownership is over. So he creates a kinship between the two of them, but distinguishes himself as someone with access to the means to communicate frustration at the status quo. That said, the destabilizing effects of the riots and their aftermath are evident in Lamming's work from the moment, almost the moment after they occur. So 1960, The Pleasures of Exile, 1958, the riots. From 1960 on, the taint of the riots is everywhere in Lamming's writing. His literary career begins again with his aforementioned and much-praised 1953 novel, In the Castle of My Skin. Again, a newer edition, just because I like the cover a bit more than the original. If you know George Lamming, you probably know this work. What it is, I guess, in summary, is a kind of mournful reminiscence of his childhood in Barbados. It's a semi-autobiographical novel. It focuses on a young boy named G for George, for Lamming, and his small, slightly peripheral community just outside of Bridgetown, the capital of Barbados. The community is represented in various ways as kind of stuck in time, trapped in amber, almost in stasis. And as the book moves through, the stasis state is shattered as the community begins to decay. And that decay is linked directly to the privations and deprivations of colonial rule. However, despite that pessimistic tone in relationship to the community itself, called Carrington's Village, we have in the character, the protagonist, G, a sort of strain or undertone of hope. So G, a bit like Lamming, is a promising scholar. He has potential. And at the end of the novel, he is in a position to migrate away from his home. And he contemplates, reflecting, written in the 1950s, on the condition of Black people in the United States, on the role he might be able to play when he returns to help those who are local. Lamming's later post-Notting Hill works slip steadily away from any real strains of hope. They slide into a kind of abject pessimism, where the Caribbean is represented as a hopeless space, as much as it is in the very first novel, but also England is increasingly represented as equally hopeless. It becomes a place that Lamming describes in The Pleasures of Exile that is a quote-unquote dubious refuge. His novelistic reflections on England climax with a book called Water with Berries, which I assume many of you do not know. It was out of print for a very, very long time, but has recently been reissued as a Caribbean modern classic by the Leeds-based publisher People Tree Press, so it's now available again. Water with Berries is an elusive and very strange novel, and I think the cover from People Tree, which is kind of hard to necessarily discern what it's an image of, is a perfect representation of this novel, and how it functions, its artistry, and also its concerns. At the heart of the novel are three Caribbean artists who are the shared protagonists. All of them are involved in relationships, mixed relationships with white women of various ages and various ways. So one, the central relationship is a love relationship. One, it's a colleague, and in the other, it's a landlady. So someone lives in a room in a rented house. And all of those relationships, in various ways, very specific to the characters who have them on both sides, end in tragedy. The final passage in the book describes one of the characters' attempts to escape the catastrophe he's experienced in England, which is a result of the dismantling or the fracturing of this relationship, in the following way. So these are Lamming's words. He was crouching near the last ridge of heather. This is him trying to escape. A crab among rocks. And in all George Lamming's work, crabs are always symbols of vulnerability. The crab is his most frequent metaphor for a vulnerable person, is like a crab. He was crouching near the last ridge of heather, a crab among the rocks. He was moving on claws. He could hear his hands scraping through the dark. His fists were smashing through the crust of the night. His chest was an apron of bone. He had ceased to feel the pebble and gravel of the earth. He is disconnected from the earth. He was coming up, sucking for air. He was on his stomach, a crab in flight, crawling through a roaring tunnel of wind. Near, he was moving forward, and so near, he had come to the end of his safety. Moving forward and so near. So a sense of almost like, if you know mass and asymptote, a line that never quite reaches the bottom. So the idea of sort of straining towards something but incapable of reaching it, which will be important for us later. We see a similar turn to this kind of hopeless representation in the works of Lamming's contemporaries, two friends of his actually, Samuel Selvon and Andrew Salkey. For Selvon, again, probably the better known of the two these days, his rollicking, career-defining, tragicomic novel, The Lonely Londoners, is followed by writing that is ambivalent about life in his native Trinidad and Tobago, and disdainful of the posturing and discrimination that makes up life for Caribbean people in England. Selvon's final novel, Moses Migrating, also I think now out of print, offers this disdain in an absurd, farcical narrative that presents its protagonist, who's an outsider in London and in Trinidad, as a rootless hybrid who cannot be accepted anywhere. So for those of you who've read The Lonely Londoners, you know, one of the many motley of characters is a Trinidadian migrant named Moses, who in the book, which is about kind of a collective of migrants, mostly from the Caribbean, but not exclusively, who land up in London in the 1950s and effectively get into a series of adventures. Some comic, again, some tragic. Moses is the almost pillar figure. He is like the central hub of the spokes of narrative and characters in the book. He's a stable figure, presented in slightly bittersweet terms. In Moses Migrating, we take the same character, and this book comes out almost 3 decades later, and change him and alter him almost completely. Where in the earlier novel, he's sort of sanguine, stable, the father figure for this group of men. In the later novel, he is a farce, this person who's attempting to adopt the styles and dress and mannerisms and speech of England, but failing completely. who's then invited on a trip back to Trinidad, and his kind of bizarre hybridity is as out of place there as it is in London, where he lives. Moses in the book is constantly stuck in between groups, and he ends the novel outside of England and outside of Trinidad, trapped symbolically in an immigration queue at Heathrow with nothing meaningful to declare. In Andrew Salkey's work, the loss of hope in the ability for Caribbean immigrants to feel at home abroad is similar to that in Selvon and Lamming, but even more acute. Salkey's first novel comes later than the other two, or his first England-set novel. He has one set in Jamaica beforehand. It's called Escape to an Autumn Pavement, published in 1960, and it's unapologetically focused on the middle-class emigrant set to which Salkey himself belonged. Again, that fraction of a fraction of a fraction of society, which is where Lamming was as well. Uniquely in its era, this book, which is in print, this is just the original cover, explored queer desire and cast a critical eye on transnational black culture, which was relatively radical in 1960. Its protagonist, named Johnny, is mobile in all senses, and he flits across the course of the novel's narrative between lovers and locales. He's disillusioned, kind of angry young man-style character, similar to the works of some of Salkey's English contemporaries at the time. I'm thinking of Silito and others. He's disillusioned, he's angry at authority, but he possesses, it's clear in the novel, kind of untapped potential. He's, a kind of boy who could make goods if he really tried, kind of character. At the end of the book, we find Johnny sort of wandering the streets of London after the book's events. I'm trying very hard not to spoil any of these books for you so that you might want to pick them up later. But anyway, at the end of the novel's events, we find Johnny sort of wandering the streets of West London, and what will happen to him, what his fate might be, I think for most readers feels relatively uncertain, unsettled, as it were, rather than uncertain. But in Salkey's later, in my opinion, better, but now out-of-print novel, The Adventures of Catullus Kelly, published in 1969, also set in London, he instead presents a Jamaican immigrant like Johnny who performs a very different role. Rather than Johnny being this person, again, in 1960, having some potential, being a bit lost, he offers us another Jamaican immigrant character who is stereotypical, who is frustrated, who is trapped, and who in the novel, which is one of the reasons I think it's still out of print, performs the role of a sexually rampant sort of black stud, an almost blaxploitation stereotype. Over the course of The Adventures of Catullus Kelly, while there are other things happening in the narrative, Catullus comes from Jamaica to find out about English culture. This is supposedly my hand working its way through the narrative, which is maybe a bit of a strange thing to do in my hand, like a saw. So this is the beginning, this is the end, these are the things that are happening. As he sort of meanders through the narrative, he is in England to find out about English culture, supposedly, in a sort of anthropological role. But he also, in the course of the book, is constantly having sexual relationships with women. While at first it seems that he's in control of these many couplings and triplings, exclusively with white women in London, I think with one exception, it becomes obvious that his lovers are exploiting him. What feels like power at the start of the novel, we realize by the middle of the novel, is actually weakness. One of his lovers even goads him significantly during a sexual encounter if, at the time, he's thinking, this is a quote, of the Negro in Birmingham, Alabama, of your countrymen in Nottingham, and, importantly, of Notting Hill. Catullus slowly loses his grip on reality, and at the end of the novel, he's left symbolically, rather than literally, impotent. Written in 1960, as race-based tensions continue to escalate, Escape to an Autumn Pavement tries to think past the pressures of its time. By 1969, the year of the adventures of Catullus Kelly, for which we don't have a cover, thinking past those pressures for Salkey seems to have become impossible. In the after-Windrush writings of these three figures, we see a kind of melancholia, a longing for a fully welcoming England that could have been, perhaps should have been, post-war. It's a hope for which Notting Hill, for all three of them explicitly, seems to have taken away. It's a way of thinking about Caribbean life in Britain, its possibilities, That's replicated in interviews with these writers' contemporaries. Again, they're from a unique social fraction, but if we look back at accounts, and on the reading list, one of the works I included is Journey to an Illusion by Donald Hines, which includes interviews with Caribbean migrants to Britain. There's a recent book also by Colin James, maybe, which is a collection of interviews with Caribbean migrants. So you see a similar sentiment replicated in, again, the workers and others who were in Britain at the time. This loss of hope. So in the novelist's work specifically, we have many symbols and motifs of stuckness, of stasis, of destabilization, of drift, as well as a range of arresting and distorted representative forms. The world systems theorist Emanuel Wallerstein has written about the tendency of social systems and social structures in their final throes to bifurcate, to splinter, and then strain chaotically for new solutions to the problems they've created before they finally break. And again, social systems and structures, when they're reaching the end of their life, start to crack. They can't sustain their own promises, and they search for solutions in a kind of frantic way before they collapse. We see something very similar in the search for aesthetic solutions, which is hard to say with braces, in the after-Windrush writings of Lamming, Salkey, and Samuel Selvon. In their writing, in those works I mentioned, we find wild, sometimes thrilling experiments in search of a form to capture the impasses in which they saw themselves and their contemporaries as being stuck within. In the words of Virginia Woolf, in a very different context, talking about her own search for a form to represent her era and her own feelings, we find in these after-Windrush writers works which include failures and fragments because, and this is Woolf, where so much strength is spent on finding a way to tell the truth itself is bound to reach us in rather an exhausted and chaotic condition. In a context of rising hostility to Britain's visibly migrant backgrounds in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the literary establishment had less and less tolerance for the truth that these writers had to offer. Among the most promising writers of their generation, which their contemporary reviews can attest to, the early reviews of their work are unbelievably glowing. And one of the sort of wonderful discoveries of my research is going into the archives of the Times, the Spectator, the Times Literary Supplement, and reading just how sort of enthused and enamored critics of the 50s and 60s were with the writings of these figures, absolutely in love with them. But despite that initial promise, as they switched to writing about the contemporary situation in Britain and experimenting with form, all three of them slipped to the fringes of the British literary sphere. Their disillusionment ultimately leading to departure, and not symbolic departure, actual departure. Having all arrived in Britain in the 1950s, Lamming, Salkey, and Selvon, each in their own circumstances, each in their own ways, departed for the Americas to find more receptive publics in the following decades. And, as alluded to, two of the three works I mentioned are now completely out of print. In a move toward a conclusion, I want to take us all back to another site in history, again as a collective, and again as spectators, to slip back into a past, but to a time much closer to ours. It's a soggy 14th day of March 1981. We, all of us, stand on the banks of the Thames and watch an estimated 20,000 people from across Britain coming to the end of an over 8-hour march from New Cross, South London, that will snake its way through Hyde Park, via Fleet Street and the Houses of Parliament. The marchers, all 20,000 of them, are chanting and are demanding justice. 13 dead and nothing said, they chant. Blood I go run if no justice come, they chant. What do we want? Freedom. When do we want it? Carrying road with red banners, they march. The fabric on the banners marked were the names of 13 young people killed in a fire at 439 New Cross Road, just 2 months before. There's a special energy in the marchers, an urgency to their protest. Many, like all the victims of the fire, are Britons. Most, like all of the victims of the fire, are Black. Despite the ages of those who died in the fire at 439 New Cross Road and the suddenness of their loss, No condolences had been expressed by politicians or the press. Despite the police first to the scene stating there were signs of fire was a result of a racist arson attack, no detailed investigation had been launched. As an aside, no detailed investigation had been launched into the murder of Kelsey Cochrane either. At Blackfriars Bridge, police rushed the protesters to drive them back, but fail. On Fleet Street, journalists hang from windows to watch, some shouting racist slurs, and the protesters still continue. Dubbed the Black People's Day of Action by its organizing committee, the day, in the words of poet Linton Kwesi Johnson, quote, made the British state sit up and take notice of the fact that we had power. We had power, and we could mobilize that power. When one of the marchers was asked if the day was important in a filmed interview, she responded, "It's more than important, brother. This is a beginning. It's not the end." When I speak of after Windrush, I speak of all the time after the promise, the dream offered to Windrush-era immigrants of an England that would cherish them for their contribution, that if you worked hard and you did the right thing, there would be space for you and you'd be accepted. I speak of the time when it was clear that that dream was exactly that, just a dream, was nothing more than a dream, exported across the ocean. In Salkey, Selvon, and Lamming, as well as in the words of their peers, we see a melancholic response to that loss, a mourning for an England that could have and should have been. It's a mode of writing that's replicated in the after Windrush era works, and when I say after Windrush, I mean now, and I probably mean the future, of a range of artists who came in their wake. Many Black and Asian writers have inhabited this after, they've dwelled in it, they've turned over the promise and the felt betrayal from multiple perspectives in their works as they sought a form to best represent it. And the list of them is as long as the individuals who've been writing since 1958. But there's another tradition, both literary and social. It's a bolder and more assertive tradition. It's younger and less quiescent. It responds to the after Windrush in the same way as the resistors to the Notting Hill riots and to the marchers on the 14th of March, 1981. A tradition that fights for a right to belong, fights for the right not to be taken for granted. It's one that looks at the rhetoric of threat, of parallel lives, of failed efforts at multiculturalism, of migration is bad unless it's mine, my family's migration, that responds to serial attempts in times of crisis in the country to place the blame on the newly arrived, rather than the architects of the status quo. It's another tradition, and it's a tradition that resists. Today, on the 65th anniversary of the resistance to the new Caribbean communities of Notting Hill, in the center of a long-dead empire, with you, as a collective, I want to mark the after Windrush period for all its losses, its broken promises, its betrayals, for all the painful reassessments it's triggered in its wake, for all the needless deaths, as a beginning, a long beginning for a new regime that will emerge after this bifurcation, not an end. Thanks.
Just to kick us off, I'd like to take the privilege of the chair just to say, well, again, thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. And I was just wondering if I could ask you, you mentioned a couple of figures, well, one figure in particular, Alan Sillitoe. And I was wondering about some of the other novelists around at the time who were also finding that received narratives were insufficient, that they were struggling to fit themselves into existing forms. I also think of Colin McGuinness, for example. People who were feeling that society, that they needed to write their way through the changes they were experiencing but didn't have words for. How were these groups of people sort of interacting, do you think, in your opinion?
They weren't.
Okay.
Not particularly. So the generation of, predominantly white male British writers, young, writing in the late 50s into the 60s, often referred to as the angry young men, which include Kingsley Amis, Martin Amis's father, were very much responding to the identical social conditions. So there is a book by Alan Sinfield, who's title has completely escaped me, where he describes the moment post-war as the moment of the broken promise. So, all of us have done World War II history of Britain at some point, necessarily. We know that, scores of lives were lost, and they were lost from across the social stratum, but the greatest losses came from the working classes of the country. Immediately after 45, in the run-up to 45, there was a clamor for change, right? And this was registered by politicians and also just the average person, that we could not then return after that great sacrifice on behalf of the country to the status quo beforehand, the slums, the huge, massive gaps in kind of social tiers. So there's this clamoring for something new. Out of that clamoring, of course, comes the NHS, comes the expanded welfare state. But Sinfield argues that we see not very long after 45 that promise of a leveled society broken. And out of that comes these sort of working class youth movements, which are, for a variety of different reasons, kind of upset with the kind of preceding generation, right? Philip Larkin's famous, "They F you up, your mom and dad." I don't know if everybody knows that, yeah. So there was also there was a parallel broken promise for Caribbean migrants, but interestingly, because they really came from the upper stratum of their society, when they came to the British literary world, that's where they entered. So people like Lamming and Selvon were associating with Louise MacNeice, with T.S. Eliot, with George Orwell, at the BBC, in the smoking rooms, etc. And that was kind of where they were. Economically, they weren't there. They, Selvon did part-time work cleaning, mopping a pub, I think, but sort of socially, culturally, that's where they were located. And that kind of patrician 1%, we might say these days, or intellectual 1%, really looked down on the writing of the angry young men. So, it's one of these bizarreries in the history of Britain where we have, two working class, effectively, communities, in this case Caribbean and then white British. Caribbean being mixed, of course, there are white Caribbean migrants as well. Responding to effectively a betrayal by the state, but doing it in their own separate spheres. And the kind of rhetoric that was coming out at the time was ensuring that those spheres stayed separate, right? That the reason that things are not working for you, group over here, is because these guys came over, and enabling this kind of division. And we see a similar division in the writing of the time.
How do you think a novelist such as Andrea Levy fits into this tradition, especially with her novel Small Island?
Okay, it's a really good question. You will have noticed that all the writers I talk about were men. That ties to the fact that up until maybe the mid-50s, the vast majority, I have a statistic somewhere, of migrants to Britain from the Caribbean were men, which is linked, I think, in part because of, gender dynamics at the time. The person who would go out and kind of journey across the shore to send money back would more likely be the male. The war is a big part of it as well. A lot of the people who came to Britain were former servicemen who had fought in World War II over here and then, established themselves somewhat and came back over. And also connected to gender dynamics, there were women writers from the Caribbean at this time who were broadcasting stories on a very famous BBC radio show called Caribbean Voices. But again, I keep saying this, but gender dynamics, these women, when they came to Britain, often weren't afforded the same opportunities to advance in their literary careers as their male counterparts, and had families and caring responsibilities and so on, which kind of prematurely cut their careers short. And on your reading list, there's a piece by Alison Donnell, which talks about this history of women Caribbean writers of this era. That dynamic changes as we move through time. So this first wave of men kind of come in, are feted, get accolades, and then effectively kind of vanish. And then there's successive waves of writers of Caribbean and broader black backgrounds, including people with migrant roots on the African continent itself. And out of that swirl from the 1960s, late 60s into the 70s, we get more women writers. And then as we move towards the turn of the last century, increasing numbers of black British women are writing and publishing. And Andrea Levy is very much of that kind of later generation. I think it's interesting because women's writing is less fixated on this broken promise in some ways. So there's a very good biography called Black Teacher by Beryl Gilroy. Paul Gilroy, if you know him, his mother, about her experiences coming to Britain. It's a memoir, and being a primary school teacher, and then eventually a head teacher, where it's very much the narrative is very different. It's not I've been betrayed. It's difficult, and I need to make it work. And I feel like the rhetoric of women's writing of these eras is more along those lines. And I think it's possibly, again, unfortunately, going back to chauvinism, masculine bias. There's almost an expectation of the men that they ought to be able to fit in a way that if you were a woman from not necessarily affluent backgrounds, if you had dark skin, if you were journeying into Britain, you probably didn't expect you would just waltz into be able to establish yourself in positions of power. And I feel like we see that in the writing. Anyway, Andrea Levy. So she, in her book, is not Small Island, I think, as bitter about this broken promise as some of these male writers are. But it's interesting that there's some replication of the things that they're fixated on mixed relationships, on this kind of surprise at reception as well, although the characters do work through it. I think it's very interesting that in her novel, and actually quite a few contemporary novels, the book ends with the birth of a child who is mixed, and that mixed child almost signals the generation to come. And it's interesting how in the novels of these men writing earlier, mixed relationships pretty much always fail. So there's a weird kind of preoccupation about romantic relationships as almost an emblem of the possibilities for social relationships, which I find quite interesting.
Great answer, thank you. And there are a few more comments along similar lines. So mentioning about a degree of misogyny in some of the novels that you mentioned, and sort of where are the female writers in this? I think it's very interesting what you're saying, that at the time sort of all women were struggling to get published on the same sort of level playing field as men, obviously. But what quite a few women were doing, they were doing forms of writing, and they were certainly active. So they were doing things like organising, like you're saying, the sort of practical, okay, let's make this work. And of course, we've got a comment saying, there's Claudia Jones in this mixture somewhere, of course. I believe quite significant, did a lot of, sort of journalistic type writing, and quite significant for Notting Hill, I believe. So I think, let's acknowledge that.
So for those who don't know, Claudia Jones, really instrumental in the aftermath of two of these events. So the person who established the Notting Hill Carnival in the wake of the Notting Hill riots. The first carnival was held indoors. And also the person who organized in the wake of the death of Kelso Cochrane, both to fundraise to pay for his funeral, but also to set up an organization to kind of respond to that loss. But I think that's very much almost that counter-history that I gestured at. So the individuals who, Claudia Jones definitely being one of the vanguards here, the individuals who were resisting, so recognizing the broken promise, but trying to fight back against it, versus those who have kind of fallen into a sense of sort of borrowed into the loss, as it were.
Really,
and these writers were definitely chauvinists, everybody. I don't want to in any way gloss this over. These were men writing in the 1950s. They were from a kind of elite fraction. They were circulating in, by no means all male worlds, but, relatively male professional worlds. Their early works are very heavily weighted by the sexual politics of their era, both in the Caribbean and in Britain. Although we do see in all of them some transmutation as they age, and in fact, as they begin to organize alongside women.
So there are women present, and they are sort of telling stories, and they're creating the possibility for future stories. And I think it's a really thanks for all you guys who raised that point. Really, really good point. But it is really important with these novels, and you brought this out really clearly, I think, that there is a need to start giving new form, new structure, new voice, new forms of story to these very difficult, almost wordless or hard to express experiences for which conventional or existing narratives are broken, are fragmented, are problematic. As such, would you say that there were any distinctive or particular forms or narrative devices which lend themselves to the purposes of the Windrush writers? Do they develop any? Do they, and how do they then sort of generate a new genre?
Yeah, this isn't me. It's been noted by quite a few scholars, but within the sphere of Caribbean writing, you have novels about a collective emerge very early on and become a standard feature of writing from the space. So you get fewer novels, even Lamming's in the Castle of My Skin, which I talked about the person who migrates away. There's an oscillation between his story and the story of the community. And throughout Caribbean writing, we have books which are focused on a sort of a mass and tell the stories of multiple people simultaneously and are representing many different individuals within the community. Lonely Londoners is a great example. So I think that's like one particular unique formal feature of Caribbean writing from this time that carries well into the present.
That's great. And I think we've got time just for one more question. Remember, don't worry, if you had a question, please submit it through Slido, and hopefully we'll be able to grab you back and do a podcast with you, which will accompany the lecture online. But your last question, and I think personally it's an excellent question, quite challenging though.
Yeah, I love
it. All
right. Go for it.
What would you recommend a 16-year-old girl? This is true. What would you recommend a 16-year-old girl to start reading from the Windrush literature?
Oh gosh, if you haven't read anything, always start with the Lonely Londoners. I think it's a wonderful book, unbelievably accessible, and as I said, it does reflect the politics of its time, but it's a lovely snapshot and insight into that moment. I think of the books I mentioned, it's the only one that's never fallen out of print. It has always been in print since 1956, and that speaks to how enjoyable it is. I absolutely adore the writing of Samuel Selvon, and he's got about a 50% hit rate from me, so about half his novels are very good, half his novels are maybe not as good. But his books set in Trinidad, which feature a character called Tiger, a brother son, and also Turn Again Tiger, I would highly recommend as well. And then from there, I probably would try In the Castle of My Skin.
In the Castle of My Skin. Okay. Please join me in giving a really warm thanks to our speaker tonight, Dr. Malachi McIntosh.